Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this webinar this morning, which is brought to you by Bidwells and the Land Promoters and Developers Federation. I'm very conscious that we are going to be trying to achieve a 1 hour finish, and all our presenters are trying to limit their presentations to 5 minutes. We will therefore have a very active question and answer session, and I'd be very keen for you all to put forward your questions via the question and answer facility at the bottom of your screen. Now, obviously, this is a very, very important area, and it's one that many of our members, both full and affiliates, have raised with us, bearing in mind, and I will still call it, the imminent passage of the Environment Bill. I think with a lot of the development industries, we've got within the development industry, we've got a number of issues that we are grappling with, and this is one of them. So I think the timing of this webinar, I hope you will agree, is very apposite, and it is going to impact how we bring developments forward, potentially how those developments are shaped on the ground and the places that we make. And of course, for some of us, for our landowners, it may well have an impact in terms of land values and potentially the necessity to find off-site opportunities to provide the appropriate level of biodiversity gain. So it's a very, very active area for our sector. So without further ado, I will pass you to our first speaker, who is Dr. Nick White from Natural England, who is leading on the aspects of this policy across government. Then he will pass over to Matt Wall, an ecologist. Then we will go to Roland Bull of Bidwells, and finally Jonathan Easton, who will look at the legal aspects of Biodiversity Net Gain. So thank you very much. As I say, keep the question and answers coming in, please. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paul, and good morning, everybody. My name is Nick White from Natural England, and I just want to give you a quick kind of run through the Environment Bill, its provisions around biodiversity net gain, and what I think this means for developers and people with interest in land holdings as well. So, apologies, the screen's being a bit slow, just to transition. So the key components of the Environment Bill when it comes to biodiversity net gain. Firstly, it's important to stress that this bit of the bill applies to England only, and it has the effect of amending the Town and Country Planning Act and introducing a requirement to achieve for all developments under the Act to achieve a minimum 10% biodiversity net gain, calculated using a biodiversity metric and by submitting a biodiversity net gain plan for planning approval. The bill requires that all habitats are secured for at least 30 years, and it provides for three main ways of delivery. Firstly, either on-site, then with opportunities to do off-site delivery, either wholly or in part, or lastly, through this idea of statutory biodiversity credits, where on-site and off-site through the market isn't available. It sets up a national register for net gain sites, so anyone that's wanting to make land available for net gain will need to have their land registered. And it's likely to become law about 2 years after the bill receives royal assent. So currently that's looking about autumn 2023. It's important to stress the bill doesn't change existing legal protections, and it also doesn't apply to nationally significant infrastructure projects or marine, although there are other developments underway which are looking to incentivise net gain in those places as well. There's an awful lot of the bill that's still to come in terms of the main primary legislation refers to a lot of secondary legislation, and some of those are quite significant areas in terms of fleshing out more of the details, such as what form will the net gain plan take, what exemptions might there be for particular types of development, how to deal with issues around degradation, phase developments, etc. So watch out for consultations later on this year on the secondary legislation, because there is a lot of detail that is still to be set out through that route. There's some other components of the bill as well, which are of relevance to net gain. One of them is around local nature recovery strategies. This is a new element set out in the bill. They're intended eventually to cover all of England. They're intended as locally developed spatial strategies for nature, and they're there to highlight areas that local planning authorities and others would like to see opportunities for enhancement of the natural environment. And they can be used for targeting particularly off-site net gain delivery as well. So there's a way of rewarding delivery into areas highlighted through the LNRSs. And then secondly, the idea of conservation covenants, which is a new legal mechanism that the bill introduces. So currently there's two means of securing that gain off-site. One will be through planning obligations, and the second is through the use of these conservation covenants, particularly if they're looking to be delivering beyond the kind of 30-year minimum, where the landowner is voluntarily agreeing to that. So as I said, there's three main ways of delivering net gain. One of them is through on-site, and that's through delivering of net gain by including green infrastructure and landscaping and the kind of biodiversity components of that, and enhancing those. And a number of developers will go down that route. Secondly, you can look to deliver off-site through the purchase of biodiversity units from local landowners, and you could do a combination of on-site or off-site. Or thirdly, the bill introduces the idea of statutory credits, and these are intended for use where it isn't possible to achieve net gain on your development site. There's no one available to sell the kind of types of habitats you need to achieve offsite, in which case you can go to government and purchase statutory credits, and they will be invested in landscape scale strategic projects and achieve your net gain through that route. So in terms of the timetable, there has been a recent announcement about a kind of further delay to the bill as a consequence of COVID. So at the moment, the timetable is looking roughly like this. So in spring 2021, as this year, we'll be releasing the final version of the metric. In the kind of summer, autumn time, there'll be the consultations on the secondary legislation I was referring to. It's about that same time. There'll also be royal assent for the bill. There's then a 2-year transition before the bill legally comes into effect, which is likely to be in autumn 23. But before then, the net gain register and the credit sales platform will be going live. So anticipating those to go live sometime winter 2022, because they need to be ready before the bill comes into effect. So a couple of key things to watch out for developers. Firstly, think about net gain early. So the earlier it's considered, ideally at site selection, outline design phase, the easier it is to kind of think about how it could be integrated into the scheme or be looking at delivering off-site. And there is some existing good practice guidance out there from the likes of Syria, SIAM and IEMA, and there's a British standard coming out for biodiversity net gain processes as well. Also be aware of what any local priorities are, undertake your baseline metric calculations, and consider how your scheme is going to deliver into kind of local priorities and what your strategy for achieving net gain is. And then ultimately, you will be needing to submit a finalised metric calculations and a net gain plan to the planning authority. For landowners, there's real opportunities here to be selling into a net gain market. So firstly, it's around identifying land parcels that may be suitable for habitat creation or enhancement. Consider whether you want to set up as a habitat bank or as a non-habitat bank. There are advantages if you are a habitat bank. Again, there's guidance out there or coming, which hopefully will be useful to refer to. Similarly, be undertaking some indicative metric calculations to see what kind of net gain uplift you might be able to secure on your land. Be looking out for details about the net gain register and how to the process for getting land onto that register. And then be thinking about what your sales price is going to be, and particularly any additional costs you want to factor into that, such as ongoing management, legal fees, etc. And then lastly, be prepared to enter into a kind of longer term, at least 30 years legal agreement if you are wishing to sell land into the net gain market. So, so that's it for me. I will hand over to Matt Wall now, who's going to talk about the metric in more detail.
Thanks, Nick. Oh, sorry. Hello, everyone. My name is Matt. I'm Senior Ecologist at Water Natural Infrastructure Consultants, and we are an ecological arboricultural practice, and we also offer landscape and topographical services. Sorry, there's a bit of a delay on the slides. Okay, so as Nick's already briefly touched on, there are a few key documents that ecologists and developers need to be aware of when they're undertaking a net gain assessment. The first is obviously the biodiversity metric, the new version of which will be released soon, so Biodiversity Metric 3.0. There's also a user guide and a technical supplement which have some really useful information in them. And there's also Good Practice Principles, which is a joint document by SAIM, IEMA and Syria. And of course, there's the forthcoming Environment Bill. So in terms of the key stages of the metric, there are broadly speaking 4 stages of this. So the first is the Onsite Baseline, which I'll be going into in some detail in this presentation. Once you've assessed the baseline of your site, you've then got to assess what habitats you're going to be creating on site if you're doing on-site habitat creation. There's also then, if you can't deliver it all on site, you look at off-site baselines. So what habitats, what does the area that you're going to be creating habitats in currently support? And then off-site habitat creation. So what are you going to be putting on that site? So stage 1 of the baseline assessment, as ecologists, we need to understand what habitats you have and how much of them you have. And this is normally undertaken by a habitat survey. So most of you will be familiar with the phase 1 survey standard. But the biodiversity metric uses the UK HAB system, which some of you may not be aware of. So we classify the habitats and calculate the size of those habitats in AutoCAD, QGIS or other mapping software. And my tip for this is, for the most accurate assessment under the metric, we recommend that UK HAB should be used instead of phase 1. There is a translation from phase 1 into UK HAB, but as with many translations, there is some information lost in that translation. So we would recommend using UK HAB for this. So when you're getting quotes from your ecologists, double check that they're using UK HAB. Phase 1 is okay, but we recommend using the UK HAB so it ties in well with the metric. Stage 2 is we make an assessment of the condition of the habitats on site. So obviously habitats can be in different conditions, and we compare these to reference habitats. A tip for this is that your ecologist should make the assessment of each habitat transparent, so that at the planning stage, the LPA ecologist and other statutory consultees can see how they've achieved their assessment of condition. And there is a section in the metric, there's a comment section in the metric for the assessor and the LPA to look at this. We also include this in our reports for complete clarity, and transparency is one of the key sort of principles in assessing condition of habitats. The third stage in assessing how important habitat is the assessment of strategic significance. So this is sort of how important is this habitat in the local or wider landscape scale. The tip here is that local strategic planning documents will usually identify these areas in their green infrastructure plans, biodiversity SPDs, etc. If this information isn't available, you assign a score of 1 in the metric, which doesn't prejudice the outcome. It doesn't adversely or positively affect it. So just want to do a very quick example now. This is just an example site. You'll have to excuse the habitat colours. They're not the standard mapping colours, and they're a little bit gaudy. So my apologies in advance. So as we can see, we've got a large area here of arable and grazing area. We've also got a pond here, and then surrounding the pond, there's some modified grassland, a small area of formal gardens, and some mixed scrub. So what we as ecologists can do once we've produced the baseline is to go out on site, have a look at it, come back to the office and do that baseline assessment for you. So you can have an understanding immediately as to how many units are at the site, what habitats, what percentage of those units are habitat support. So you can see that the arable here is 56% of the overall units, the pond's 37%, and that can sort of guide you as to where your development should be going and what your offsetting contribution is going to look like. We try and do it as a traffic light system to make it a little bit simpler. Other consultancies may have a different approach to this, but this is the sort of useful information that you can get from that baseline to understand where you can target your development. And finally, in terms of habitat creation, as Nick's already mentioned, this can be on-site, off-site, or a combination of both. If you can't achieve the habitat creation off-site, then you can look at credits. Our view is that habitat creation shouldn't just be the most valuable habitat, so not creating sort of homogeny in the UK of the most valuable habitat on the metric. It needs to reflect local appropriateness conditions and complement the proposal as well. If using off-site habitat, the baseline of this area also needs to be considered and taken into consideration. And our tip for this is to get the baseline done as quickly as you possibly can so that your ecologist can provide you with an indication of the developable footprint, and you know how many units you'll need to provide and what habitats this could look like. I hope that's been useful information for you. I'll be around for any questions, and now I'll just hand over to Roland.
Thanks, Matt. So, yeah, I'm Roland Bull. My main role is heading up the rural investment team at Bidwells, where we provide a comprehensive management service on something over £1 billion worth of agricultural and rural property for institutional landowners like Cambridge colleges and the likes of the Wellcome Trust. But having studied ecology as an undergraduate, I've got a particular interest in the financial and contractual structures associated with large-scale habitat schemes. So I've actually built up quite a large client base of wildlife trusts and other conservation NGOs who I've advised on the structuring of habitat delivery initiatives, particularly associated with large developments. So there's a whole series of factors that need to be considered. And one of the things we heard from Nick is that the Environment Bill isn't actually going to come into force for some time yet, probably at least 3 years. In the meantime, we've got policy evolving, local planning policy evolving in parallel with that, and a significant number of authorities already have net gain requirements embedded in policy, and many developers are already having to consider that at an early stage in development proposals. So it clearly does have implications for promotion agreements, option agreements and collaboration agreements. And that's not just the inclusion of sufficient land, but clearly development appraisals and equalisation mechanisms and minimum land prices. And I've actually had promoters, for example, coming and approaching me in respect of clients' land, suggesting that they'll provide a minimum land price on land that is otherwise constrained from a development perspective. And clearly, that's just not a commercial approach to be able to take. So we've got the question of whether you deliver on-site and off-site at the moment, and clearly there is a policy preference for on-site, but also some commercial advantage in terms of natural, immediately accessible natural green space and the value implications that has for unit sales. But as soon as that starts impacting on development density, clearly there is a commercial imperative then to deliver off-site. So at the moment, as I say, we're looking really at small ad hoc solutions to satisfy net gain requirements as and when they come about. And when we're doing that, there are very significant implications for transactional costs and the economies of scale in delivering small habitat creation initiatives. So when you're looking for an off-site solution for biodiversity net gain, a lot will depend on the very specific requirements. So the metric does require like for like provision or like for better. So there is some scope to substitute habitat types with off-site provision. And an example of this, so this is a map of Cambridge, and looking at some biodiversity opportunity mapping work that I've been doing with the local wildlife trust to identify areas with significant biodiversity potential around Cambridge. So one of those areas immediately to the southeast of Cambridge is a network of triple SIE calcareous grassland sites. And so one of the developers that I'm currently working for has a requirement for some open mosaic habitat, which is sort of dry, gravelly habitat that has particular ecological benefits for reptiles and invertebrates. And actually what we're looking to do there is substitute that for appropriately managed calcareous grassland. And the key there is that the sustainability of that management, probably well beyond the 30-year minimum requirement, is such that actually it's a far more cost-effective solution in terms of providing that, and a much more credible solution, rather than creating an incongruous and inappropriate form of habitat that in the long term is unlikely to be managed appropriately. So again, there's lots of considerations around who will be involved, and that will depend on the complexity and nature of the habitat. Certain simpler forms like hedgerow units are very easily provided by existing farming businesses, whereas other larger and more complex forms, are probably better delivered through specialist conservation organisations. So again, just thinking about some of the immediate requirements where developers are considering net gain in advance of the Environment Bill and some of the provisions that will bring about for, as Nick said, conservation covenants and registries. At the moment, while we're looking at ad hoc deals, there is that opportunity to go to brokers and habitat banks, but certainly my experience is that they typically won't have access to appropriate sites and will want to extract a significant value from any transaction that's done. So, where I have put deals in place and I'm working currently on deals, what we've done is tripartite Section 106s that can be entered into in advance of a planning application, even, or an appeal, where the landowner might be party to that, the developer's party to that, the LPA's party to that, and it essentially has a call option for the developer to call that management and put in place the management plan as and when the consent is implemented. And that would be assignable. So as I say, if it's a promoter, they can then assign that to a house builder that they sell to. So some interesting things around funding and the options available to developers there. I've been involved in several where house builders have either offered or actually provided property to conservation organisations to deliver management on sites in lieu of future management. But actually, a lot of those conservation organisations aren't well placed to accept the investment risk associated with some of those assets. So, very concentrated single asset risk. And so, in other instances, I've been working with large, well-diversified institutional investors who are very well placed to take on some of that long-term commitment and can absorb those funds into a well-diversified portfolio and effectively discount them at a lower rate than would be the case for a small conservation charity. And actually, this photo here is a National Nature Reserve that's managed by one of Nick's colleagues, where I'm working with an institutional landowner to create a very large biodiversity net gain initiative immediately next to that, where we will be able to create credits at scale very, very cost effectively to be able to sell it to the market. So certainly my expectation is that in due course, we will see offerings that can deliver net gain credits very, very cost effectively at scale and with more consistent forms of legal agreement that reduce the transactional costs. So I'm going to pass over now to Jonathan Easton.
Thank you very much indeed, Roland. There we go. Thank you. So I'm Jonathan Easton, a planning barrister from King's Chambers in Manchester. I've been given 5 minutes, and those people who have ever been on the receiving end of a council's time estimate will know that you can set your watch by it. So I will keep to those 5 minutes as best I can. So a series of traps that I've identified, and I'll come up with a number of tips which I hope will be useful. So first trap, statutory drafting. Not for the first time in the last 11 months, I'm going to use the expression, the devil is going to be in the detail. An awful lot of the nuts and bolts of the way in which BNG is going to work is going to be in secondary legislation, policy and guidance, as we've already heard from Nick. A particular issue which is going to, I think, be resolved in secondary legislation is the way in which larger schemes are dealt with. So it's exceptionally unusual for large strategic sites to rely solely on the original parent outline planning permission. The market changes, unforeseen constraints may emerge, and developers obtain Section 73 permissions or freestanding consents for part of the site. It's unclear at the moment how that will be addressed and how you'll resolve issues about biodiversity net gain when you have a freestanding planning permission that sits within an outline permission for a much larger site. So here's tip number one. I foresee an increased use of Section 96A of the Town and Country Planning Act, which relates to non-material amendments. As those listening will probably know already, the Section 96A variation leaves the original planning permission intact and should avoid the issue of having to secure a 10% biodiversity net gain on a new planning permission if that is ultimately the way the government decides to go. Another issue, the policy framework is relatively vague, or if you have a different point of view, is relatively weak at the moment. The national policy position is that biodiversity net gain is a good thing. There is no specific percentage uplift that developers have to achieve. And so in those circumstances, there isn't at the moment, so far as I'm concerned, a robust policy justification for local authorities seeking anything more than a net increase unless there are specific increases embedded in their local plans. There is a scope for debate here. Biodiversity value is calculated up by reference to a metric, as we've heard already. The value is going to depend to a very large extent on professional judgment. Professionals disagree. I do just wonder whether in circumstances where differences in judgment could lead to a significant financial difference, whether that's going to lead to an emergence of a sort of objectively assessed need argument. In other words, there will be scope for considerable debate about whether individual ecologists have reached proper judgments about the pre-development and post-development net gain. So tip number two here, one answer, especially for members with larger land holdings, is to undertake and record regular biodiversity assessments of land with development potential, so that at least there's a record and hopefully less scope for debate when an application is eventually submitted. The next issue, which I'll deal with very briefly here, is that delivering biodiversity net gain could be particularly costly. That there are going to be some questions to unravel as to whether the extent to which the delivery of biodiversity net gain is going to affect viability. One can reasonably assume that because the standard biodiversity net gain condition is going to be imposed by statute, that in terms of ranking, it will rank higher than other policy requirements. So one question to think about relatively early on is the extent to which delivering biodiversity net gain is going to affect viability. So in that respect, two tips here for the price of one. Engage early with the local planning authority. The biodiversity gain plan doesn't have to be submitted, or won't have to be submitted until after planning permission is granted, but I see nothing wrong, and in fact quite a lot right, with submitting a draft biodiversity gain plan to the local planning authority with the application. So this will give a longer time to resolve any disputes, avoiding delays down the line, and it also recognises that many local planning authorities, certainly at the moment, don't have the in-house expertise to deal swiftly with biodiversity issues. The second point to bear in mind is engage early with landowners. Many sites being considered now will probably be subject to statutory biodiversity net gain when they are promoted for development in the years to come. So it makes sense to fold in biodiversity net gain into negotiations now, whether that reflects in amended offers or securing additional land for off-site biodiversity net gain. I've touched on the extent to which this could be delay or red tape, and so engaging early, I think, is a very good idea. Similarly, the extent to which local authorities have resources is a large concern, particularly in relation to in-house expertise and the extent to which local authorities will have the resources to deal with post-development enforcement. I've dealt with a few top tips there. I'm going to, given the time constraints, I'm going to run through a few of these top tips. Regular baseline monitoring, which I think has been mentioned by another one of the speakers. Early engagement is a matter I've touched on already. Engagement with landowners, again, as I mentioned earlier on, securing biodiversity net gain as part of the negotiations for land purchase or option agreements is a very sensible thing to do now, frankly. Get involved in plan making. So plan making is an area in which national policy and the Environment Bill is almost completely silent. It's unclear whether net gain across a local authority area is going to be incorporated into sustainability appraisals or whatever is to replace them. But my next tip is to get involved in the plan making process, whether that's through proposing allocation or designation of off-site biodiversity areas or seeking to influence biodiversity policies. And this speaks to a broader issue, which I think has been subject to a number of different webinars over the last 11 months. So the lack of joined up strategic planning generally. There is considerable merit, I would say, in examining biodiversity net gain at a plan level, not least because it could direct investment in natural capital to the areas that need it most rather than on a site-by-site basis. Off-site delivery is something to think about now, frankly. The likelihood of third-party organisations delivering off-site biodiversity gain is likely to increase, and I've given a specific example with an appeal reference there. It was land in Milton Keynes at South Caldecott, where a Section 106 obligation secured off-site offsetting, and that was going to be delivered by the Environment Bank. And there's some useful analysis by the planning inspector in that appeal decision of how that meets the local and national policy requirements and how it was going to deliver biodiversity net gain in the longer term. I mean, biodiversity makes good economic sense. That's the conclusion of Professor Sapata Dasgupta, whose 600-page review of the economics of biodiversity, which was commissioned by the Treasury, was published the other day. There's an abridged version of 103 pages, and for the time poor, a 10-page headline messages document. But one of the things for developers to bear in mind is that in terms of marketability, having green areas both on-site and in close proximity off-site could lead to successful placemaking, and it potentially, and there is evidence for this, could lead to an uplift in property values. So the key battle lines I've identified there: valuation of biodiversity units, is this the new objectively assessed need? Receptor sites, where they're going to be, application of exemptions, and viability, which I think is something that a number of proponents of biodiversity net gain and the government haven't properly thought through just at the moment. So that was a counter. Thank you very much indeed. Back to Paul.
So first of all, thank you to all the panelists for keeping their presentations broadly in line with the 5-minute timetable. So very helpful. We have quite a long list of questions, so we will try and work through those, and apologies if we don't get to your question. But I think, Nick, if I could I open up with what seems to be a quite wide-ranging sort of number of queries in our questions about the size and scope of the biodiversity net gain sort of legislation and the types of development that it affects, what exemptions there may be, and also just I'm interested, if you've got off-site, is it like SANG that the off-site receptor for the biodiversity net gain has to be within a certain area? Does it have to be within the same local authority area, and so on and so forth? So Nick, could you pick up a number of those questions for us, please?
Yeah, sure, Paul. So in terms of the size and scope of the legislation, so it covers all, I'll come on to exemptions in a second, it covers all developments under the Town and Country Planning Act. So that's covering developments including down to the mean low water mark. So it's worth mentioning that as well. So there will be kind of intertidal, kind of coastal developments that get picked up by this too. There was a discussion when DEFRA did their original consultation on the bill as to whether there should be an exemption for kind of minor developments. And in the end, it was agreed not to, but what's being put forward, and this will be coming out in the spring as a consultation version, is a metric for use for smaller developments, so for minor schemes. So it's intended for use where the development site doesn't have kind of high priority habitats on it, and where the kind of the nature of development is small in scale. So it doesn't necessarily require an ecological survey for those particular sites, as you would do for the bigger ones. In terms of exemptions, there is a bit of secondary legislation that's being worked on this. So do keep an eye out, because there will be a consultation coming from government later on in the year. I mean, areas that we know of that are highly likely to be exempt are things such as permitted developments, likely exemptions for householder applications. There's a discussion around kind of brownfield and kind of what types of brownfield may or may not be in scope. And obviously, from my perspective, the wording of that's quite critical. There are some brownfield sites of very high biodiversity value. Equally, you don't want to necessarily preclude bigger, large areas of urban areas as well. So, but there will be a government consultation on the kind of range of exemptions that they're looking to bring into scope. So do keep an eye out on that. So, and then you also talked about the offsite and does it need to be in close proximity to the development or not? So a couple of things to mention on that. So firstly, Jonathan talked about the kind of potential for net gain to contribute towards wider placemaking. So there are opportunities clearly for being able to use net gain as a mechanism for demonstrating what a development can do in terms of improving the quality of place for local residents. And that will be of an interest to planning authorities as well and to councillors. That said, the metric within it also has a kind of multiplier that tries to keep or encourage development within, off-site net gain delivery within the same planning authority area or within the wider national character area. But the multiplier is quite small, and there's nothing to, in theory, prevent you from delivering your net gain elsewhere in the country, and some brokers do that as well. So the land they're contracting is elsewhere. But often there's a local kind of plan sort of interest in trying to keep delivery quite local. So I think there's no straight answer to that. I think assume to try and keep things local, because that will be helpful in terms of securing the kind of planning authority support as well. But there's no hard and fast requirements. And just very specifically on SANG, we are hoping that you'll be able to demonstrate some additional things you can do in the SANG, which could be contributing towards your net gain calculation as well. So there's also opportunities with the SANG sites as well for contributing towards net gain.
Thanks, Nick. Very quick follow-up. Minor development, will that include extensions to existing buildings?
I suspect extensions won't be covered, but again, until we've seen the detail, I can't say for certain on that, I'm afraid. But
Jonathan, I think you were, thanks Nick. Jonathan, I think you were going to pick up a question. Will off-site biodiversity mitigation being paid for as a contribution be given the same planning weight as on-site mitigation?
Well, there's a couple of responses to that. First of all, one thing that the bill at the moment isn't clear about is whether there's a hierarchy of on-site, off-site and biodiversity credits. I think inevitably that's going to be followed up by policy and guidance, which will indicate that the preference clearly is for on-site followed by off-site, followed by biodiversity credits. The question here is that delivering biodiversity net gain is going to be a statutory requirement. There's going to be a condition imposed by statute. Now, there are two schools of thought here. One is, I can imagine some local authorities will say you cannot gain any positive planning weight because all you're doing is complying with a statutory requirement without which you wouldn't get planning permission. In many ways, that's similar to some local authorities who argue that if you are delivering a policy compliant amount of affordable housing, then you shouldn't get any extra credit for that because it's a policy requirement. My view on that is that because biodiversity net gain is not only a statutory requirement, but it's also going to have collateral and additional benefits in terms of improving biodiversity, improving the quality of placemaking, you could probably gain some additional credit for delivering biodiversity net gain, whether it's on-site or off-site. But if the hierarchy is developed in the way that I think it would be, the chances of you securing more weight for on-site compared to off-site are probably greater.
Okay, and I'm going to follow up, perhaps Jonathan, and then maybe Nick can come in as well. There's a question regarding Section 106 agreements. Are they the best mechanism for ensuring biodiversity net gain delivery, bearing in mind on a lot of larger sites, they can be amended during their life as phases of the development come forward?
The answer to that question, I think, depends on how the government's going to deal with multi-phase developments and whether or not it's going to require an extra, let's say, for example, you have a freestanding planning permission within a large strategic site, or you have a Section 73 permission within a large strategic site. The question then becomes, how is the government going to deal with that situation? Are you going to be having to deliver 10% upon 10% upon 10% as the site is developed through? I think the advantage that Section 106 obligations have is that you're right, Paul, they can and are varied, and they have a degree of flexibility that perhaps a conservation covenant might not have. On the other hand, a conservation covenant has the certainty that the piece of land is going to be secured for biodiversity and conservation purposes for a very significant period of time.
Okay, thank you. Nick?
The only thing, just to add to what Jonathan was saying, so on phase developments, again, watch out for a consultation. There's a kind of bit of secondary legislation that will specifically kind of look to set out some further detail on phase developments. So I think watch out for that. The other thing just to draw people's attention to is the planning white paper as well. So it set out a range of proposals for reform of the planning system. And we don't know which of those will be taken forward in detail yet as well. But again, that may have implications in terms of how and the mechanisms for securing net gain delivery as well. So that's just something else to kind of keep an eye on.
I think there are a number of questions which are around the purchase price of statutory credits. Now, Nick, is that something that is already determined or that will develop as the legislation and secondary legislation is implemented?
It's a work in progress, if that's the best way of describing it. So when DEFRA consulted, they did give an indicative range at that stage as to what they thought some the kind of pricing for credits might be. It's fair to say they got a lot of responses back on that as to whether that was the correct price or whether it was too low, and particular concerns that had been set too low. Credits are intended to be the mechanism for ensuring that a development doesn't get stuck. So it's always got a route for delivering net gains. If you can't do net gain on site, there's nothing available locally or through the market, then there is always a way through for the developer. But they're not designed to be the kind of go-to route for delivering net gain either. So part of the consideration is around pricing them at a point whereby they are seen as not competing with the kind of market delivery of net gain as well, so being deliberately more expensive in that route. There may also be some further guidance on them for planning authorities to consider as to what would you need to do to justify going down the credits route. So what information would you need to be provided to say, I can't do net gain on site, I can't do net gain through the market. There may well be some more information coming out in the near future from government on what the credit pricing kind of range might be as well. There's still a lot being discussed around, is it a single price, is it a regional price, etc.
Okay. And another one for you, Nick. You're getting bombarded, I think, this morning. We've got a question from a nature partnership, and how they can maximise the use of nature recovery networks for strategic biodiversity net gain. And I think in this particular instance, somebody's working on getting a network opportunity written into a local green infrastructure policy, and they're basically asking for or seeking input as to advice as to, is this the best way to promote the nature recovery network for biodiversity net gain credits as an off-site delivery vehicle for developers?
So firstly, fantastic to see this work is underway, actually, and I'd encourage it elsewhere as well. So great stuff. And yeah, I mean, basically, the more information and the simpler the information that can be provided via the planning authority that sets out in a local area what the local priorities are for nature conservation, and particular if there are spatial priorities as well. So where would you like to see existing assets improved, or where would you like to see new green assets created, the better. A couple of things I'd mention would be often, or in the past, there's been a tendency for some of these mapping work to forget about the urban peri-urban area, and bearing in mind that's where most development will occur, and we're expecting a lot of on-site and off-site delivery to be occurring close to development. Then do consider those parts of the locale when looking at the kind of the opportunity mapping area, and also don't necessarily focus solely on very high priority habitats as well. Also think about other sort of intermediate habitats that could provide more of a kind of buffering, connecting role as well. So don't focus purely on the what you might want to call BAP priority habitats. But it's great to see this work underway, and the more these kind of this information can be embedded into either local GI strategies or ultimately through the local nature recovery strategies as they roll out, the better, because hopefully they provide clarity, and they're used as Matt was saying to help then inform the kind of metric calculations, so you can incentivize delivery into those places.
Okay, and thanks, Nick. And this is again a question for you, but I think Roland might be able to help as well. There are a lot of questions regarding habitat banks and non-habitat banks, and I suppose just trying to understand what the requirements are, who's managing them, where do people find out about them, and how do they tap into that?
Yeah, so just very quickly, for the uninitiated, habitat banks are helpful because what they're doing is they're creating habitat in advance of a development taking place. So from a net gain calculation perspective, normally the metric is assuming your habitat work hasn't started until you tell the metric and put the information in. So it's normally factoring in various failure risks and factoring in the fact that habitats take a long time to create, so it reduces the amount of units you can generate from land. A habitat bank has been deliberately set up in advance of all of that, so the metric is able, the final version of the metric will allow you to account for that. So essentially, from a landowner's perspective, it means you'll be able to generate more units from your land if you're a habitat bank than your neighbour who's not a habitat bank, because a lot of that risk has been taken out. The habitat is there. The register will ultimately provide a mechanism for allowing someone to say they're kind of identify themselves as a habitat bank. In In the meantime, though, what I would encourage people to do is talk to your planning authority, make sure they're aware of what you're proposing to do, that you're undertaking this work specifically because you are setting up as a habitat bank for net gain purposes. But so we do need to make sure equally that someone doesn't just turn around and say, oh, I happen to have this area of woodlands that's always been in my land. I'll just now sell it for net gain purposes. You can't do that. That woodland was already there. But if you planted that woodland early with the intention of financing it through selling into the net gain market as a habitat bank, then that is legitimate. There will be guidance coming out on this, but in the interim, I would talk to your planning authority and just make sure they're aware that this is what you're doing and you're establishing yourself as a habitat bank.
Thanks.
I mean, I'd question how realistic that actually is in terms of local authorities being sufficiently engaged to recognise, effectively speculative habitat creation in advance of the requirement coming about. I mean, it will be a fantastic thing, when that is embedded in legislation and when you're actually able to do that. But I think in the short term, certainly my experience is that, local authorities aren't sufficiently well advanced in their thinking to be able to recognise advanced creation in that way. I mean, as Nick says, not only does it help with risk metrics, but it's also clearly a way of being able to create habitat at scale and far more cost effectively. And again, I mean, I'm doing a lot of work for several wildlife trusts, coming back to the local nature partnership thing, where you can imagine the portfolios that they're already managing are of quite high existing biodiversity baseline value. So where they are looking to participate in that net gain market, they then need to secure interests in land with a low existing baseline value. And so, clearly what we're doing there is searching not only for the land that has the greatest biodiversity opportunity, but then also layering that up with other factors and obviously trying to identify land that doesn't have significant alternative use potential. So, these sort of values will never compete with conventional forms of development, for example. So, clearly what you need is land with a low existing use value, but high biodiversity potential and a low baseline value. So as I say, that is the basis on which you will most cost effectively create credits. And I'm certain that as the market evolves, we will get, conservation initiatives of, regional significance that can create credits at scale very cost effectively and offer them into the market as it becomes more liquid.
Okay. Thank you, Roland. Now, maybe to the panel, maybe Jonathan would like to comment. There are one or two questions that link into the whole local plan development process at a strategic level here, and what local authorities are actually doing about this. And I think before we started the webinar, some of the panelists we were discussing, there are a number of local authorities people should be aware of that are bringing forward biodiversity net gain, which is in excess of the Environment Bill requirements of plus 10%. But what is the progress? I think, Jonathan, you touched upon it, of incorporating these requirements within local plans, and at what level, and therefore what impact?
I mean, it's relatively patchy nationally. I mean, as you rightly say, there are some local authorities who have specific percentage requirements. I think one of them is as high as 20% in their local plan policies. Now, clearly that level of uplift has been found to be sound and inconsistent with national policy. National policy, I think, as I said in my presentation, is relatively vague. It seeks to achieve a net gain, albeit without a specific percentage. So some local authorities acted for a local authority an examination recently where there was a broad objective of securing net gain, albeit without a specific percentage. So I think it does pay for developers to make absolutely sure that they are not promoting development in an area. Well, if they are promoting development in an area, to make absolutely sure what the local policy position is, whether in local plans or supplementary planning documents. There may be in areas where, for example, there will be a 10% biodiversity net gain requirement in statute. And if there's a local authority requirement for an extra 10% on top of that, that is what you're going to have to deliver. but I think some clear national policy guidance about whether or not at a local level 10% is the minimum is necessary to provide a degree of consistency across the country. We don't have that at present.
Anybody else on the panel commenting on local authority planning?
The only thing I'd add to that, Paul, is in terms of the bill, it talks about a minimum 10% as well. So, so the idea of there being potential variability is there in the bill as well, with the 10% being the floor, if you like.
Okay, thank you. A lot of questions, Nick, about public access to, is it a requirement that there is public access to the biodiversity net gain land, especially I think the questions in relation to off-site delivery?
So no, it's not a requirement, but then equally, the bill doesn't change any existing kind of environmental access legislation either. So if there are existing access rights, the bill, suddenly having a site that's there to deliver net gain doesn't change that. Clearly, there are, as others have alluded to, there is a real opportunity for net gain to be contributing towards placemaking and providing, as COVID has demonstrated, that one thing that we all value is having access to green space, and there's huge inequalities in terms of people's ability to access that. So potentially, it can be really beneficial, but equally, depending on the nature of the kind of habitats being created, and particularly if you're looking to create for particular species interests, there are species that are very prone to disturbance as well, and so there can be kind of tensions between what's level of access there is and what you're trying to achieve on site. So it's just being mindful of what it is you're seeking to achieve ecologically, and being aware of actually how viable that may be with or without access requirements. And you could do combinations of things where your a component is delivering into a kind of strategic project somewhere else, potentially that where the access issues are less. But equally, you could be integrating net gain on your site or very locally, and doing it in a way that has fantastic public access. I mean, there's a scheme about 20 minutes from where I live. It's a big new development. It's all delivering all net gain on site, and it's a fantastic kind of new kind of local community resource as well. So it depends entirely on what you're attempting to achieve.
Paul, do you mind if I just add to that?
Yeah,
quickly?
no, feel free.
I mean, I'm working on several schemes at the moment where we are looking to provide sort of multifunctional habitats that provide wider natural capital benefits, and some of that's about public access, some of it's about flood attenuation, carbon sequestration, even where we're looking at wetland recreation, or where actual significant tree planting is compatible with the sort of optimal ecological objectives. So we can deliver your biodiversity net gain, but deliver a whole range of wider public and environmental outcomes. And I think actually the planning system is one of the only opportunities where that whole range of benefits is potentially recognised, where the other markets for landowners to participate in the delivery of environmental outcomes, so private markets like carbon credit sales and other natural capital benefits. As I say, planning is probably the one where actually that range of benefits can be recognised in terms of presenting very credible propositions in terms of the the wider benefits that a development can secure. And I think developers are engaged with that now, and as I say, I'm working on some very interesting schemes that will deliver a huge range of environmental benefits as part of that biodiversity delivery, and public access is a key part of that, both on site and off site.
Okay, I'm going to ask this of Nick, but I think this might be unfair, Nick, but I'm not sure. So apologies. Is there anybody here that can comment on biodiversity net gain as it is being applied in Scotland or devolved areas?
So the bill applies only to England. The metric has intentionally been designed for, so it's based on UK HAB as a system, as Matt mentioned. So it can work in other bits of the UK as well. And we know SSE Energy, for example, are using it in Scotland. And it can work in other places. There's different, but the environment is a devolved matter. There's different kind of planning and other sort of environmental policies in other administrations. So there is I'm not sure if it's still live or if it's just closed, but there has been a consultation recently in Scotland looking at the question of environmental enhancements and whether they should use a metric or not. It's yeah, that's a slightly waffly answer. I don't know if I've answered your question actually.
It's fairly unfair question. It often happens in that we focus on England rather than the UK,
But the other thing, just finally to quickly add as well, is that net gain is also gaining traction outside of the terrestrial world. So there's now quite active discussions in the marine sphere about what would marine net gain look like. And certainly terrestrially, there's going to be issues anyway in estuaries such as the Dee and elsewhere where you've got kind of cross-boundary issues, across jurisdiction issues. They'll become even more to the fore, I think, with marine as well. So I think looking ahead, there will be a need for kind of greater cooperation between jurisdictions on how this may work.
Okay, and I'm very conscious of time. So this question is of Nick in relation to how things might develop. Hello?
Yep.
Yeah, sorry. How things may develop in the future in terms of the timings with the bill and some of the clarity that people seem to be seeking in their questions about values applying to statutory credits, what may or may not be exempted through your from the minor development. What are the timings on those, Nick? Because I'm beginning to think with the popularity of this webinar and the amount of questions that have been asked, that we should probably have another webinar, at some point down the line when things become clearer.
Yeah, so I'm slightly hesitant to put dates given the kind of previous track record of slippage of dates of parliamentary timetables and things. But assuming that the current parliamentary timetable holds, then, as I said, a lot of the detail of net gain is still to be set out, and there will be consultations on secondary legislation, which begins to thrash a lot of that out in the kind of summer, autumn of this year. Questions on pricing on credits, how the register works, that should start to become clearer over the course of this coming kind of calendar year, because there clearly is a need for clarity on that, which is kind of well recognised. There's also a recognition of a need for kind of further guidance for planning authorities, for developers, for landowners, etc. as well. Some of that will be taken forward by government. Others are looking to provide it themselves, such as professional bodies. So there is more information starting to trickle through. I would add that there is this transition period, so it's not envisaged that everything's going to be ready as soon as the kind of bill is cleared. There will be a kind of implementation period. So please do watch this space. And yeah, I mean, I think personally, I think a follow-up would be really useful, because I think there's more to say, and potentially there's developments taking place outside of the bill as well, which may be of interest to people in terms of as net gain gains momentum elsewhere.
Yeah, I'm pretty certain we'll hold another one of these, Nick, in the not too distant future, and where we can, with questions that we've not answered, we will come back to people outside of the webinar environment with a response. We'll try and cajole the panelists into giving a response to those unanswered questions. I think, to try and stick to the timetable, I'd like to bring the event to a close. First of all, by thanking all of the panelists for their time this morning, and secondly, I'd like to thank Kirsty at Bidwells for all of the organisation. Very much appreciated. I think one of the things that comes out of this is, as ever in the development industry, it is it is quickly developing, and it has impacts for us already in a number of areas. As I say, there are local plans in place in certain areas where this is being implemented, and therefore we're getting to grips with it, notwithstanding, as Nick and the panelists have highlighted, that some of this is developing, and as yet is perhaps less clear than we would wish. But I also would say, I think from this there are opportunities. I do agree with the people that highlight the potential to improve place, to improve the quality of the open spaces within developments, and as a consequence, perhaps some of the accessibility to those that are impacted by development but are not actually housed within the development. They don't have their home within the development, and therefore that can make a positive contribution to community in a number of areas. So I think what we need to do is, obviously we need to be very conscious of the impacts that it has on development viability and timings and so on and so forth, but at the same time we do need to embrace the positives of this and actually use it as a way, a positive engine to get people to buy into development. It can be an important, as Nick has highlighted, in this post-COVID era, or what hopefully will soon be a post-COVID era, it can get people bought into the idea of improvement in green space. And I think that could be an extremely positive community benefit for us as a development sector to sell to those impacted by new development. But look, thank you all for your time. And as I say, thank you to the panelists for theirs as well. All of them volunteers, all stepped forward when it was very clear that we should be hosting an event on biodiversity net gain. And as I say, I think we will need to hold a future event as things transpire. So thank you all for your time. Thank you.